Have you ever wondered what happens to consciousness when the body dies? That question has haunted philosophers, priests, scientists, and ordinary people for millennia. Today, it's also a question modern neuroscience is seriously investigating, not to endorse any particular belief, but because strange, repeatable data keeps turning up in hospital wards, lab cages, and clinical trials. In this video, we're following the evidence, the brain activity recorded in dying patients and animals, the accounts of near-death experiencers, carefully controlled research into mediumship, and the fierce debate that divides experts. What you'll find is not a neat answer, but a series of surprising clues that force us to rethink what death really means. Let's begin with something that sounds counterintuitive. Researchers have recorded bursts of organized, high-frequency brain activity in subjects who are clinically dying. In animal experiments, teams have monitored the brains of rats during cardiac arrest and, astonishingly, observed transient surges of electrical activity, patterns that resemble some aspects of conscious processing, in the seconds after blood flow stops. In at least one human case reported in the literature, clinicians recorded a surge of EEG gamma activity around the time the patient's heart ceased beating. These are not the chaotic, noise-like firings you'd expect from neurons running out of energy. Some patterns look eerily like the brain's conscious signatures. Scientists like Jim O'Borjegan and colleagues argue this hyperactivity could help explain the vivid, structured experiences people report when resuscitated. The finding is a red flag. The dying brain may not simply switch off, it could be a last burst of organized activity that correlates with the intense imagery and awareness. People often describe those brain spikes are scientifically fascinating, but what about the people who come back and tell stories? Near-death experiences, reports of tunnels of light, life reviews, out-of-body perspectives, and profound feelings of peace are surprisingly common among survivors of cardiac arrest and other critical events. Studies estimate that a significant minority of resuscitated patients report such experiences. The phenomenon is cross-cultural and remarkably consistent in many elements. Some clinicians and neuroscientists treat these narratives as purely neurobiological, powerful brain states produced by oxygen deprivation, drugs, and dying neurons. Others see them as potential windows onto an aspect of consciousness that the classical brain-centric model doesn't fully explain. Sam Parnia, who has led the AWARE studies and related work, has documented cases where patients accurately report events that occurred while their brains appeared inactive, which is provocative and controversial in equal measure. Whether these accounts prove anything metaphysical or not is unresolved, but they demand explanation. And medical researchers are increasingly designing studies to look for verifiable correspondences between reported experiences and external events. If the dying brain sometimes produces organized activity, and if some survivors recount experiences that seem to bridge clinical death, that opens a practical question. Can the living communicate with the dead? That's where studies of mediumship and anomalous information reception enter the picture. Over the last 2 decades, a handful of research groups have attempted to study mediums under controlled conditions. Some laboratories, notably organizations like Windbridge and various university teams, report that certain mediums produce accurate, verifiable information about deceased persons they could not have known by normal means. Meta-analyses of controlled experiments have suggested small but statistically significant effects beyond what chance or simple fraud would predict. These studies are methodologically difficult and have attracted intense scrutiny, but they exist. Investigators have documented hits, misses, and puzzling patterns that resist easy dismissal. The existence of replicable, blinding resistant effects would not automatically prove an afterlife or post-mortem communication, but they would force the scientific community to take the phenomena seriously and test alternative explanations rigorously. Skepticism is crucial here, and the skeptics have strong arguments. Critics point out that memory is fallible, that information can leak in subtle ways, and that statistical artifacts sometimes masquerade as real effects. Some neuroscientists emphasize that to report a near-death memory, you must later have a functioning brain capable of storing and narrating the event. Therefore, any veridical report must have been encoded by active neural tissue at some point. Other researchers argue that post-resuscitation reports could reflect mistimed memories or confabulations after brain function returns. These are not straw-man objections. They're methodological guardrails. When extraordinary claims are on the table, extraordinary controls are required. Careful experimental design, pre-registration, and independent replication are the only ways to move from anecdote to evidence. Yet the data that worry skeptics are mounting, and not always from the margins. Clinical teams with access to intensive care units are starting to capture physiological traces during resuscitation. Continuous EEG monitoring in some cases has shown that the brain's shutdown is more complicated than a single moment. The tachyarrhythmias, gamma synchrony, and transient coherent activity recorded in dying animals and some humans hint that processes associated with perception, synchronization across brain regions, for instance, may transiently reemerge or reconfigure during death. Some neuroscientists cautiously propose that this could represent an internally generated state of heightened perception, a last-ditch reconfiguration where the brain, in its final moments, reorganizes information in unusual ways, whether that amounts to ongoing subjective awareness, disconnected from neuronal hardware, is a deeper, philosophical and empirical question. Another piece of the puzzle that's hard to ignore is the pattern in large-scale meta-analyses of mediumship and anomalous information reception. When researchers pool decades of controlled laboratory experiments, a non-trivial statistical signal persists in some analyses. Mediums sometimes provide readings with more accuracy than strict chance predicts under blinded conditions. The size of these effects is contested and the mechanisms completely unknown, but three possibilities emerge. First, some unknown cognitive or perceptual ability in mediums that allows them to pick up on subtle cues. Second, methodological flaws left uncorrected. Or third, that anomalous information transfer occurs by mechanisms currently outside mainstream science. Each of these possibilities has enormous implications. If the first is true, we're looking at previously unknown human capacities. If the second, we need better science. If the third, the implications would be revolutionary. Responsible scientists typically bracket their conclusions. The data are suggestive, not definitive, and they demand more robust, pre-registered, and independently replicated research. Let's talk about theory for a moment. How could communication after death be possible, even in principle? There are several broad frameworks people invoke. One is that consciousness is an emergent property of brain processes, a pattern of firing that depends on tissue integrity. Under this view, any post-mortem communication must be explained as misperception, encoding artifacts, or pre-existing brain activity that was not fully extinguished. Another framework treats consciousness as fundamental, a primary feature of reality that may persist independent of particular brains. Proponents of this view sometimes draw on quantum or field-based metaphors, suggesting that information may not be strictly localized to neurons. Physicist anesthesiologist Stuart Hameroff and collaborator Roger Penrose, for example, have proposed quantum models of consciousness that some interpret as allowing a non-local persistence of conscious information. These theories are speculative and controversial, and most neuroscientists remain unconvinced, but they demonstrate that the conceptual space is wide. The data force theory building, not dogmatic dismissals. Alongside the laboratory work, there's the human data, thousands of near-death narratives, cross-cultural reports of similar experiences, and people who claim ongoing relationships with deceased loved ones via mediumship. For many, the evidence is existential rather than empirical. A bereaved person who receives a detailed, verifiable message through a medium experiences a powerful kind of evidence that changes life choices, reduces grief, and sometimes shapes entire communities. Scientists must respect how meaningful these experiences are while still applying the rigorous tests of reproducibility and blinding. That tension between human meaning and scientific stringency is one reason research in this area has been both emotionally charged and slow to progress. What would convincing evidence look like? Ideally, it would combine independent verification, tight controls, and reproducibility. Imagine a controlled, pre-registered experiment where mediums make specific, detailed predictions about verifiable events associated with a deceased person that could not plausibly be known beforehand, with robust statistical power and independent replication. Or picture continuous monitoring of multiple physiological variables during cardiac arrest, combined with external visual or auditory targets hidden from rescuers and patients, where later veridical reports match objectively verifiable targets. Researchers like Sam Parnia and teams conducting aware-style protocols have attempted such approaches, putting objective visual targets in resuscitation rooms to test out-of-body perception claims. Those studies are difficult, expensive, and rare, but they point to the right method: objective markers that can be verified independently of memory. There are also practical and ethical challenges. Can you run rigorous double-blind tests in an emergency room? How do you control for information leakage in grief counseling settings? How do you design experiments that respect the dignity of dying patients while asking hard scientific questions? The field is learning to answer these questions. Larger, multi-center trials, transparent pre-registration, independent auditors, and the use of artificial intelligence to analyze large bodies of testimony for patterns are all strategies being adopted. As methods improve, the fog around the phenomena will hopefully lift. It's worth pausing to address the risk of wishful thinking and exploitation. Claims of after-death communication can bring comfort, but they can also be weaponized by charlatans or misinterpreted by vulnerable people. Scientific inquiry does not exist to stamp legitimacy on comforting beliefs. It exists to test claims and to protect people from harm. Responsible research in this area requires safeguards, informed consent, clear reporting of effect sizes and limitations, and clinical oversight. At the same time, ignoring a body of data because it's uncomfortable would be unscientific. The middle path is rigorous curiosity, treating anomalous reports as data, not doctrine. So where does the weight of evidence lie today? My honest take, based on what peer-reviewed studies and reputable research centers have published, is this: there are intriguing, reproducible signals that consciousness-like activity can occur near clinical death. There are controlled experimental results in mediumship literature that show small but non-trivial effects under certain conditions. And there are veridical reports from resuscitated patients that sometimes align with objective markers. None of this is proof that the living can routinely communicate with the dead in an ongoing, verifiable way. It is, however, enough to justify continued, better funded, and more transparent research. The phenomena are not irrational superstition. They are an empirical puzzle at the border of neuroscience, psychology, and culture. What are the most promising next steps? First, larger multi-site clinical studies that pre-register hypotheses and place objective targets in resuscitation environments. Second, more rigorous, blinded mediumship experiments with independent replication and publicly available data. Third, more detailed neurophysiological mapping of the dying brain across species with careful translation to human contexts. Fourth, interdisciplinary teams, neuroscientists, statisticians, ethicists, and bereavement specialists working together to design humane, scientifically rigorous protocols. And finally, open data sharing. Let other scientists analyze the raw reports, EEG traces, and experimental logs. Science progresses fastest when data are transparent and methods are replicable. For the curious layperson watching this video, what should you take away? First, be humble. We still don't know enough to draw absolute metaphysical conclusions. Second, be open-minded. Repeatable anomalous data are a good reason to investigate, not to panic. Third, be cautious. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and the burden of proof lies with those making the claims. And finally, recognize the human dimension. People find comfort, meaning, and sometimes life-changing closure in accounts of after-death communication. That human reality deserves respect, even as we apply the scalpel of science. The story unfolding at the edge of life is one of mystery and method. It's about EEG spikes in dying brains that force us to ask whether consciousness has a final flare. It's about carefully controlled experiments that suggest mediums may sometimes access information that defies easy explanation. It's about survivors telling stories that refuse to be dismissed as mere hallucination. It's also about healthy skepticism and the necessity of rigorous protocols. Science doesn't hand out certainties, but it does offer a path forward. Test, replicate, critique, refine. If the data eventually show that something like post-mortem communication is real, it will be one of the most profound discoveries in human history. If the data collapse under scrutiny, we will still have learned something crucial about perception, memory, and the brain at its limits. So as you close your eyes tonight, you might think about two things. One, that science is bravely leaning into one of humanity's oldest questions and doing so with tools our ancestors could not imagine. Two, that whether or not communication after death is ultimately proven, the phenomena we're discussing have already transformed lives. prompted new science, and expanded the conversation between faith and reason. That perhaps is the most compelling evidence of all. The way these questions push us to be both more rigorous and more compassionate, a rare and necessary combination in the search for truth.
If you find this video informative, please hit the like button, subscribe this channel, and feel free to share your comments.